The year was 1972. Hurricanes at the time were named after women, a practice that started in the 1950s. Male names wouldn't be added to the list for another 7 years in 1979. The Atlantic hurricane season, which runs from June 1st to the end of November, had just begun when on June 14th a tropical depression formed near the Yucatan Peninsula, moving into the Gulf of Mexico. That depression would eventually become the first named tropical storm of the 1972 season, Agnes, and would go on to spread death and destruction across the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. This is the story of how Agnes came to devastate parts of the southern tier of New York. First, let's talk about the damage. In the U.S., Agnes affected 15 states and the District of Columbia. Almost 110,000 houses were ruined by Agnes. In addition, more than 5,000 mobile homes were either damaged or destroyed. Small businesses also suffered extensively, with close to 6,000 experiencing either major losses or complete destruction. Cost estimates ranged between $2 to $3 billion, and adjusted for today, costs would be over $15 billion. Agnes killed 128 people worldwide, 119 of which occurred in the U.S., spread across 8 states, including 24 deaths in New York. Agnes was, at the time, the costliest hurricane on record in U.S. history. As you might imagine, it has since been surpassed, repeatedly. In fact, Agnes currently ranks number 20 on the list of costliest hurricanes, with Katrina, Harvey, Ian, Maria, and Sandy taking the top 5 spots. And it is a safe bet that costlier hurricanes will continue to occur. Here is a quick quote attributed to 2 men who were intimately familiar with both hurricanes and with Agnes. Quote, "The life history of Agnes is most appropriately divided into 2 parts. One, a June hurricane that developed, strengthened, and moved to its landfall on the coast of the Florida Panhandle in close accord with a climatological expectancy, and the other, a dissipating tropical depression which, having moved inland, became rejuvenated under the stimulus of a vigorous baroclinic environment." End quote. That quote was from Herbert Saffer and Robert Simpson. If that sounded a little technical, there is a good reason. Just 1 year before Agnes hit the U.S., this famed duo of civil engineer Herbert Saffer and meteorologist Robert Simpson, who at the time was the director of the National Hurricane Center, developed what came to be known as the Saffer-Simpson scale of wind speeds, seen here, that defines hurricane categories. This is still the system used to this day to define hurricane strength. The main point of their quote was that this storm really has 2 distinct and separate parts. It's an unusual meteorological situation in which it wasn't the hurricane that did the most damage. It was the second part, when it became extratropical, that it did the most destruction. Unusual, but not completely unfamiliar, as this is similar to what happened with Superstorm Sandy. I will try to explain these parts moving forward, namely the difference between a barotropic low, in this case a hurricane, and an extratropical cyclone, or baroclinic low, which is what was mentioned by Saffer-Simpson. To understand what Saffer and Simpson were talking about, let's take a look at the typical life cycle of an Atlantic hurricane. Understand that this is just a common example. Where a storm forms, how quickly, where it tracks, how strong it gets, and how long it lasts can vary widely from one storm to another. The first step that occurs, often in the first 1 to 5 days, is with a disturbance or cluster of thunderstorms. In the common example shown here, a tropical wave exits the west coast of Africa, moving west. Step 2, if that cluster of storms moves into a favorable environment, which we will discuss in a moment, during days 5 to 6, it can strengthen into a tropical depression. Step 3, if it stays in conditions that allow it to grow, by days 7 to 9, it can become a tropical storm. Step 4. Continued favorable conditions, helped by an increase in rotation, can allow the storm to strengthen into a hurricane in days 10 to 15. Here in Step 5 is where our story gets interesting. As the storm moves north into cooler waters, it moves into a very different environment, one filled with warm and cold clashing air masses separated by fronts. As mentioned by Saffir-Simpson, it's known as a baroclinic environment. At this point, often the storm starts to weaken because the surface will provide less heat energy and less moisture, the two things that fuel hurricanes. But it also starts to change into a different kind of storm, what is known as an extratropical cyclone, basically meaning a non-tropical storm. This type of storm is characterized by warm and cold air masses, meaning that it is baroclinic. And while it is a very different type of storm, it can still do a lot of damage. I said the storm often will weaken, but at this point, if the upper atmosphere is conducive to growth, sometimes at this stage the storm can actually strengthen, which is exactly what happened with Agnes. Interestingly, this transition between tropical and extratropical is often observed, but is one of the areas of meteorology that is still not fully understood. Okay, so what makes a hurricane? There are 6 widely accepted ingredients for a hurricane or tropical storm to develop. The first condition is that ocean waters must be equal to or greater than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Below this threshold temperature, hurricanes will not form or will weaken rapidly once they move over colder water below 80 degrees. Ocean temperatures in the tropics routinely surpass 80 degrees, particularly between the months of June to the end of November, when they receive more direct sunlight. The second ingredient is distance from the equator, generally between 5 and 20 degrees latitude. Hurricanes need the rotational force caused by the spin of the Earth, known as the Coriolis force, in order to form. The Coriolis force generates a counterclockwise spin in the northern hemisphere, which enhances low pressure. Coriolis force is at a maximum at the poles, good for rotation, but the water is way too cold. Water is plenty warm enough at the equator, but the Coriolis force is far too weak. So the sweet spot for tropical storm development with warm enough water and also enough rotational Coriolis force is between 5 and 20 degrees latitude. The third ingredient is that of high instability near the center of rotation of the storm, a steep lapse rate with very warm air at the surface and cold air aloft, ensuring the maximum release of latent heat. Hurricanes are warm core lows. The heat hurricanes generate at their center is from condensing water vapor to water as it convectively rises and forms clouds around the eye wall. The lapse rate must be unstable around the eye wall to ensure rising parcels of air will continue to rise and release large amounts of heat energy, strengthening the storm. The fourth and one of the most important ingredients is low vertical wind shear, especially in the upper level of the atmosphere. Wind shear is a change in wind speed with height. While shear is an important component of developing severe thunderstorms, for tropical storms, wind shear is their kryptonite. Strong upper-level winds actually destroy a tropical storm's vertical structure by displacing the warm temperatures above the eye and limiting the vertical rise of air parcels. Weak crosswinds throughout the column are critical, and hurricanes will not form when the upper-level winds are too strong. The fifth ingredient is high relative humidity values from the surface to the mid-levels of the atmosphere. Dry air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere impedes the ability of the hurricane to develop by increasing evaporation. Since evaporation is a cooling process, it reduces the warm core structure of the hurricane and limits vertical development of convection. The sixth ingredient is that you need a spark, frequently in the form of a tropical wave or disturbance. Often, hurricanes in the Atlantic begin as a thunderstorm complex that moves off the coast of Africa. It becomes what is known as a tropical wave. If this wave encounters favorable conditions, as listed in the first 5 steps, it will amplify and evolve into a tropical storm or, eventually, a hurricane. Okay, that is how a hurricane starts. Now I want to talk about what steers hurricanes, known as the steering flow, the flow that tells hurricanes where to go. Large high and low pressure weather systems push hurricanes around like corks in a river. A hurricane may seem very large, but compared to global scale circulations, they are relatively small. In the North Atlantic Ocean, air circulates clockwise around the Bermuda High, also sometimes called the subtropical high, which is a semi-permanent global circulation. Remember, clockwise flow for high pressure, counterclockwise flow for low pressure. High pressure is usually responsible for pushing hurricanes westward in the tropical Atlantic. Hurricanes are then guided northward around the west side of the Bermuda High, directing some hurricanes in the direction of the east coast of the United States. A very strong Bermuda High will push hurricanes past Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricanes can be directed to hit New York in a couple of different ways. First, let's talk about pathway number 1, which was the same pathway taken by Hurricane Irene, seen here, which caused severe flooding damage in New York and Vermont in 2011 and resulted in the death of 40 people in the U.S. This pathway looks a lot like the last slide, right? The Bermuda High initially pushed Irene westward toward the Bahamas. Then, Irene, still blocked by the Bermuda High, turned to the north near the Bahamas and along the U.S. East Coast. Irene made landfall first on North Carolina's Outer Banks as a strong Category 1. Then Irene made a second landfall at Brigantine in southeastern New Jersey, and finally it made a third landfall with 65-mile-per-hour winds in Brooklyn, New York, where it tracked inland across southern New York and Vermont. In this pathway, hurricanes typically weaken to tropical storms by the time they reach New York, which did happen in this case. Here is a second scenario. This is the same pathway taken by what came to be known as Superstorm Sandy. The Bermuda High, which was weaker than usual, initially pushed Sandy west and then north. But as the storm started to move away from the east coast, moving northeast, a second area of high pressure to the north, called a blocking high, pushed the storm back to the west and directly into New York and New Jersey. Before making landfall, the storm became extratropical, or a baroclinic low, just like Agnes. And like Agnes, it gained strength, hitting New York with hurricane-force winds of 80 miles per hour. The storm was directly responsible for 74 deaths in the U.S. Storms that take this pathway can stay stronger longer because they spend more time over open water. But in order to strengthen, they need that support from the upper atmosphere, which, in this case, it got. Here now is a look at the pathway that Agnes actually took. It's not quite the same as the last examples, but this clearly resembles pathway 2 on the last slide, similar to Sandy, where a blocking high pushed Agnes back to the west on a collision course with New York. Here's a quick summary of events. It all started on June 14th as a tropical depression over the Yucatan Peninsula, indicated by the blue dots at the bottom of the screen. It strengthened into a tropical storm as it moved into the Gulf of Mexico, where it gained the name Agnes, indicated by the green dots. It strengthened again into a Category 1 hurricane in the Gulf, yellow dots, making landfall on the Florida Panhandle on June 19th as a weak Category 1 hurricane with winds sustained at 75 miles per hour. It quickly weakened back into a tropical depression as it tracked inland across Georgia, blue dots, strengthening again into a tropical storm, green dots, as it approached the coast, before making its second landfall in Long Island late on June 22nd as a strong tropical storm with maximum sustained winds of 65 miles per hour. That last green dot in New York indicates part 2 of Agnes's life, when Agnes transitioned into an extratropical cyclone late on June 22nd into early June 23rd. Oddly, by far the worst damage was caused at the end of her journey, during the extratropical or baroclinic phase in Pennsylvania and New York, where it stalled and where catastrophic flooding occurred. Let's walk through the development of Agnes step by step. On June 14, 1972, the morning photo from the ATS-3 satellite seen here shows the clouds associated with the slowly forming disturbance. At this stage, it was classified as a tropical depression and was still disorganized, with winds of 38 miles per hour or less. But also of note is the mass of clouds 1,000 miles to the northeast, signaling another cloudy, rainy, late spring day over most of the middle Atlantic and northeastern U.S. In fact, by June 14th, many locations in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland had already received their normal rainfall quota for the entire month of June, so double the normal amount. This had resulted in saturated soil conditions and higher than normal river levels, contributing to the disaster that was about to unfold. Friday, June 16th. With the upgrade to tropical storm strength on June 16th, Agnes became the first named storm of the 1972 Atlantic season. Since the National Hurricane Center had begun identifying tropical storms and hurricanes with female first names starting in 1954, this was the first time the name Agnes had ever been used. It was also the last time, as it was immediately retired in accordance with the National Hurricane Center custom of preserving the legacy of particularly destructive storms. Agnes would continue to strengthen, becoming a hurricane the next day, on Saturday, June 17th. Let's skip ahead to Sunday, June 18th. By midday on June 18th, Agnes was in her second day as a weak hurricane, with sustained winds around 75 miles per hour and gusts in squalls of up to 95 miles per hour. She was moving steadily northward across the Gulf of Mexico at a brisk 12-mile-per-hour clip. Despite her limited peak wind strength, Agnes, nevertheless, had a well-defined and unusually large circulation, as shown in the satellite photo, and her effects were beginning to be felt across a wide area of the southeastern United States. June 18th is generally considered the day Hurricane Agnes turned deadly. While mainly remembered only for the massive flooding she brought to the northeastern states in the coming days, Agnes first ravaged Florida on June 18th and 19th, with what still stands today as one of the worst tropical storm-spawned tornado outbreaks in history. At least 28 tornadoes resulted in the loss of 7 lives, hundreds injured, and extensive destruction of property across Florida. This is the actual weather map from Monday, June 19th. In the days prior to June 19th, Agnes encountered a sufficient supply of tropical moisture and near-saturated conditions across the Gulf of Mexico, which we know is favorable for development. Its large circulation, one of the largest June hurricanes on record at the time, continued to extend over 1,000 nautical miles in diameter. The pressure field continued to deepen, reaching 978 millibars in the early morning hours. However, an unfavorable tropical environment caused the system to weaken prior to Agnes's United States landfall later this afternoon. As expected, soundings from the 19th revealed a noticeable increase in precipitable water values and a large area of instability ahead of Agnes. The 7 a.m. surface analysis shows heavy rain and falling pressure in Florida's Panhandle. Continuing with the 19th, Hurricane Agnes makes initial landfall Monday, June 19, 1972. As mentioned, late on the afternoon of June 19, 1972, Hurricane Agnes made landfall on the U.S. mainland, just west of Apalachicola, Florida, as a weak Category 1 hurricane with winds sustained at 75 miles per hour, then rapidly weakened back to tropical storm strength. Agnes had reached her peak intensity in the northern Gulf of Mexico earlier in the day, with winds sustained around 90 miles per hour and gusts to 120. At that time, her pressure bottomed out at 978 millibars. At the time of landfall, a storm surge of 4 to 6 feet to the east of the center caused generally minor damage to structures along the immediate Florida coastline. Tuesday, June 20th. By 7 a.m. on June 20th, a recently downgraded tropical depression, Agnes, was parked over southwestern Georgia. Rain bands from Agnes extended from the Florida Panhandle through Virginia. More Gulf of Mexico moisture continued to pool into the mid-Atlantic, thanks to a shift from southeasterly to southwesterly flow. By the second half of the day, Agnes's circulation deepened as a result of baroclinicity, the clashing of warm and cold air, but not enough to maintain tropical storm status. Agnes was about to get a boost from a secondary area of low pressure that formed from these conditions. Continuing with Tuesday the 20th, Agnes, now inland, begins her northeastward march back to the sea. On the 20th, the moisture-laden tropical remnants of what one day earlier was Hurricane Agnes, now just a tropical depression, trekked steadily northeastward across Georgia and South Carolina. By afternoon, a heavy rain had spread across southern portions of the Middle Atlantic River Forecast Center's service area, especially the Shenandoah and James River basins in Virginia. Meanwhile, and importantly, a strong upper-level weather system and surface cold front moving southeastward from the Great Lakes began developing its own area of heavy rain in western New York and Pennsylvania by late in the day. This would contribute to the unfolding disaster. Wednesday, June 21st. As Agnes progressed across the Carolinas, on June 21st, the subsequent secondary low followed a parallel track to the low that was Agnes. Each area of low pressure maintained a forward speed of 12 to 15 miles per hour. Soundings all the way through Canada revealed precipitable water values well above June normals, indicating an ample amount of moisture available in the atmosphere across the Northeast. By the afternoon of June 21st, Agnes made the very unusual move of re-strengthening into a tropical storm, as the storm continued to trek to the north and east, hugging the east coast. More from Wednesday, June 21st. Agnes is reborn. The remnants of Agnes, now over eastern North Carolina, had reignited back to tropical storm strength in a relatively rare interaction with a vigorous weather system that had settled in from the Great Lakes region the day before. Rainfall coverage and intensity rapidly increased as tropical moisture streamed inland from the Atlantic Ocean. By the morning of the 21st, reports from the Virginia mountains of severe flash flooding from up to 10 inches of overnight rainfall were being relayed to the staff of the River Forecast Center in Harrisburg, and a steady northward progression of the rain made it clear that a serious river flood threat was evolving throughout Virginia. In addition, several inches of rain had also fallen overnight in upstate New York, again, and flooding of the Chemung River and its tributaries had already commenced. Thursday, June 22nd, the day before the worst flooding in New York. The 7 a.m. surface analysis from June 22nd located Agnes's center a couple hundred miles to the east of Baltimore, Maryland. At this time, rain was reported from the Great Lakes to the New England coast. Newly reborn Tropical Storm Agnes chugged northward just off the Middle Atlantic coast and now registered the lowest central pressure, 977 millibars, of her tropical life, including her brief time as a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Maximum sustained winds of 70 miles per hour measured by reconnaissance aircraft were just below the threshold for an upgrade to hurricane strength for a second time. More from Thursday the 22nd. Up to an additional 11 inches of rain had fallen in the previous 24 hours, the heaviest axis extending from central Virginia to south central Pennsylvania. Early on, Agnes was moving away from the coast, moving northeast. At an observation point in Corning, New York, in Steuben County, the State Department of Environmental Conservation determined the swelling Chemung River would crest below flood stage. And on June 22nd, Corning Mayor Joseph Nasser said the river levels were receding, as was the threat of major flooding. With Agnes out to sea, the assumption was that the worst was over. The next several hours would reveal a disastrously different reality. During the afternoon, a blocking high, like the one we discussed earlier, pushed Agnes back to the west, back towards New York. A wind-driven torrential rain fell throughout the day across much of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and northern Virginia. While the heaviest rain had just ended farther south and west, rivers in Virginia and Maryland were already raging out of their banks, in some cases at historic levels. By early evening, the James River in Richmond, Virginia, easily surpassed the previous record flood stage, set just 3 years earlier in the aftermath of Hurricane Camille, and continued rising throughout the night. Late on Thursday, June 22nd, Agnes made her second landfall on Long Island as a strong tropical storm with maximum sustained winds of 65 miles per hour. She would continue to slowly track inland to the west before stalling over northern Pennsylvania. Friday, June 23rd. Sometime overnight, between June 22nd and the 23rd, the original area of low pressure, formerly Agnes, was absorbed into the second low. The system, now baroclinic, redefined as an extratropical low, fueled by moisture, deep low pressure, and a sharp temperature differential, parked over northwestern Pennsylvania, resulting in a flooding catastrophe across Pennsylvania and the southern tier of New York. More now from Friday the 23rd. Water levels rose quickly, more than a foot an hour in some locations. Steuben County Sheriff Jack Lisi declared a county-wide emergency, and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller released National Guard troops to help evacuate residents living in towns and cities along the storm's path. While more rain would fall, and the larger rivers would continue rising into the weekend, Friday, June 23, 1972, is often remembered as the most infamous day of the Agnes disaster, especially in the Susquehanna River Basin, where rivers rose at rates never before experienced in response to more than a foot of rainfall over large areas of upstate New York and central Pennsylvania during the previous 36 hours. By Friday morning, the basin's population was realizing that previous record river levels would be threatened, and the day was spent in frantic preparation to flee or fight the surging water. By day's end, much of Corning and Elmira, New York, were underwater as the Chemung River crested several feet above the previous record levels. As the Chemung's flood wave moved downstream into the already raging Susquehanna River, levees gave way, allowing raging rivers to surge through populated areas. Sirens signaled the battle's end with the late morning failure of the levee at Wilkes Barre, and thousands of residents were forced to flee to higher ground. As conditions worsened, the basin's infrastructure began to crumble. Telephone, water, electricity, and transportation services failed throughout the day, and staff at the River Forecast Center in the Federal Building in Harrisburg sifted through sporadically arriving reports, often erroneous, to provide updated forecasts for the public, emergency personnel, and government officials, while, at the same time, concerned about their own homes and families. This scan of a page at right from the June 23rd logbook reporting the loss of critical electrical services illustrates the challenges faced by the staff. It reads, "Power out at the Federal Building at 7:15 a.m. Saturday, June 24th. Although the impacts of Agnes were far from over by Saturday, June 24th, the area of low pressure began to finally weaken as drier, more stable air filled in. Showery precipitation continued to fall from West Virginia through New England, with the highest rain accumulations of the day located in western Massachusetts and northwestern Connecticut. Okay, now let's talk totals. The heaviest rainfall and the greatest totals landed in portions of Pennsylvania, with a frightening 19 inches of rain reported in Schuylkill County, PA, and a large swath of the southern tier of New York receiving 10 to 15 inches, with unofficial reports of higher amounts. Here is the summary. During the week prior to Agnes, a large amount of shower activity, due to that secondary low, resulted in widespread areas of over an inch of rain. Heavy rain from Agnes started on the night of June 20th and continued until the 24th of June, tapering on the 25th. The maximum official rainfall amount recorded was 13.7 inches at Wellsville, New York, but unofficial reports of over 16 inches were also received. While only a small portion of New York received over 12 inches of rain, a fairly large area saw greater than 7 inches of rain, which is enough on its own to cause major flooding. And remember, this map only shows rain totals between the 20th and the 25th of June. It had already been raining for days before Agnes arrived, and the rain from Agnes fell on already saturated soil and high river levels. If you add up 7- and 8-day rain totals, some areas got significantly more rainfall than is shown here. So that's the meteorology portion. I know it's a lot, but it's also important to look at where all that water had to go. That's what I want to show you now. The highest rain totals in New York fell across sections of the Genesee River watershed and the Chemung River watershed, largely in Steuben and Chemung counties. New York's waters, lakes, rivers, and streams fall within one of 17 major watersheds, or drainage basins, shown here. What is a watershed? A watershed is an area of land that drains water into a specific water body. All precipitation drains into one watershed or another. Watersheds include networks of rivers, streams, lakes, and the area of land surrounding them. Watersheds are separated by high elevation geographic features, such as ridges, mountains, hills, and any elevated area that forces water to flow down one side or another. Now here are the two previous maps transposed over each other. As you can see, the heaviest rain was split between the Genesee River watershed, outlined in yellow, and the Chemung River watershed in red, which included Steuben and Chemung counties, two of the counties hardest hit by the flooding. While the Chemung River watershed flows south into the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania and eventually empties into the Chesapeake Bay, the Genesee River watershed flows north about 140 miles into the Genesee River before emptying into Lake Ontario at Rochester and onto the St. Lawrence Seaway. Along the way, the Genesee River flows through a lot of communities, and right through the heart of Rochester, which in 1972 was the third largest city in New York, with a population of nearly 300,000 people. While the Genesee River did see serious flooding, none of the communities impacted were hit as hard as those in the Chemung River watershed, which, again, included Steuben and Chemung counties. Part of the reason the Genesee River didn't cause more damage was thanks to an event that had happened more than 30 years prior. July 7th and 8th, 1935, another devastating flood had hit portions of central New York and the southern tier. That year, up to 12 inches of rain fell in just 9 hours, in what came to be known as the Finger Lakes flood of 1935. The damage was in the hundreds of millions of dollars at the time, well over $2 billion by today's standards, and 43 people lost their lives in New York. This event was one of the major drivers of the Federal Flood Control Act of 1936, passed the following year, which authorized civil engineering projects such as dams, levees, dikes, and other flood control measures through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other federal agencies. Central New York and the southern tier took full advantage, and the Genesee River watershed was the beneficiary of several significant flood protection projects, which were developed and built over the next 2 decades. With that in mind, here is a closer look at the Genesee River and its watershed. The Genesee River flows through 9 counties in upstate New York: Genesee, Livingston, Monroe, Ontario, Orleans, Seneca, Wayne, Wyoming, and Yates. It receives drainage from about 2,500 square miles. Before the Genesee River reaches the city of Rochester, the river flows through Letchworth State Park. Letchworth is a 14,000-acre park located in Livingston and Wyoming counties. Within Letchworth State Park is one of the major projects to come out of the Federal Flood Control Act of 1936, the massive Mount Morris Dam. The Mount Morris Dam, seen here, is said to be the largest concrete dam east of the Mississippi River, with a height of 248 feet and a total length of 1,028 feet. It was built for the sole purpose of flood control, particularly to protect the city of Rochester from a flooded Genesee River. Construction was completed in 1952, and prior to its completion, the Genesee River Valley had suffered severe flooding on average every 7 years before this dam was finished. Built into the bedrock, this gravity dam has a maximum storage of just over 400,000 acre-feet of water, or 130 billion gallons. The left side of the screen is the upriver side of the dam. The 2 photos on the left, taken on June 23rd and the 25th, show that the floodwaters from Agnes filled the Mount Morris Reservoir, and on June 25th reached the base of the Mount Morris Spillway, 248 feet above the riverbed. To avoid overtopping, on June 25th, gates were opened to prevent water and debris going over the top of the spillway and causing major damage downriver in Rochester. Close monitoring and careful releases still resulted in flooding downstream, but not nearly to the extent that could have occurred, and far less than some of their nearby neighbors experienced. Maximum inflow into the reservoir was about 90,000 cubic feet per second. However, the outflow, due to that careful release, was just over 15,000 cubic feet per second. The flooding on the Genesee River was considered a 300-year flood, meaning there's only a 1/3% chance of that happening in any given year. Without the dam, It is estimated that the Genesee River would have risen 20 feet in Rochester. Instead, the city only had to contend with 3 inches of floodwater. Had the Mount Morris Dam not been completed just 2 decades before, at a cost of $25 million, it is believed that $210 million in damage would have been caused in the city of Rochester from this storm alone. Pretty good return on investment. Even better, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers states that in the years since completion of the dam in 1952, an estimated $3 billion in flooding damages have been prevented downstream. The dam held, water was released as designed, and Rochester avoided the severe flooding that was experienced in other parts of the state. Here are a few more photos from Letchworth State Park that show the volume of water we are talking about and demonstrate why the Mount Morris Reservoir was so quickly filled to the brim. This side-by-side shows the Genesee River above Mount Morris in Letchworth State Park at a location known as Hogsback. Notice the normal river boundaries disappeared under the tremendous volume of water. Here's another view from Letchworth, the iconic Middle Falls. The photo on the left shows what the falls look like on a typical springtime day with moderate river levels. The photo on the right was taken on June 23, 1972, during the height of the Agnes flooding. Here's another view from Letchworth with the same comparison, this time showing Upper Falls. Normally a beautiful and tranquil location, on June 23rd, Upper Falls was transformed into a violent torrent of water. But the Mount Morris Dam succeeded in capturing the floodwaters flowing through Letchworth on the Genesee River, and it wasn't the only success story. The Arkport Dam was the first dam built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers following the Flood Control Act of 1936, in swift response to the 1935 flood. Completed just 2 years later, in 1938, Arkport is an earthen-style dam with a height of 113 feet and a width of 1,200 feet. The Arkport Dam, seen here, is normally a dry dam, except after heavy rains. It's able to hold back 2.6 billion gallons of water from the Canisteo River, part of the Chemung River watershed in Steuben County. Notice the spillway on the right side of the screen. That uncontrolled spillway is 160 feet wide and has a maximum discharge rate of 1,040 cubic feet per second. The photo on the left shows the Arkport Dam spillway from below on a typical day. The photo on the right shows the spillway from the top of the dam during the Agnes flooding in 1972, operating at peak capacity. During that flooding, the reservoir created by the Arkport Dam reached 100% capacity, but the dam accomplished its mission as designed and kept the Canisteo River from severely flooding downstream communities, saving both Hornell and neighboring Canisteo from what would have likely been severe damage. However, it is necessary to note that since this is an earthen dam that did reach 100% capacity, with its spillway operating at maximum discharge, even a slight increase in rainfall could have resulted in overtopping, a death sentence for an earthen dam, which could have resulted in complete dam failure, which would have produced a catastrophic flood wave, likely to have caused significant casualties in the communities below. This was a very close call, and it is unlikely that there is anything that could have been done during the storm to avert a failure. One more. In this photograph, taken June 23, 1972, near Reservoir Hill Road in Hammondsport, New York, Steuben County, the flood control efforts once again prove their worth. This flood control project was built to contain and divert overflows from the Glen Brook, as that waterway had caused severe flooding in 1935. In this picture, water levels are about 10 feet deep in a culvert that normally remains dry. Without these improvements, notes Steuben County historian Kirk House, the 1972 flood would have been significantly worse for Hammondsport, and the houses seen in the background would likely have been destroyed. But as we know, not all were so fortunate. Now let's take a look at where some of the worst flooding damage did occur, Steuben and Chemung counties. Starting with Chemung, this photo, taken at 5:30 a.m. on June 23rd in the town of Elmira, shows the floodwater beginning to spill over the concrete dike at Lake and Water Streets, which was designed to prevent just such an occurrence. It failed, and this marked the beginning of the devastating flooding in downtown Elmira. That last photo was taken at 5:30 a.m. Once it started, the flooding didn't take long. This photo from a helicopter was taken at 2 p.m. the same day, June 23rd. By that time, all of downtown Elmira was underwater. Downtown Elmira the same afternoon. This photo was taken from the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad tracks looking down Water Street on the day of the flood. The storefronts that occupied the first floor of many of these buildings were subject to severe damage, as was any merchandise inside. Also in Elmira, we know the town flooded quickly. This photo shows floodwaters raging through a residential neighborhood. Notice just how fast and destructive the flooding was. And here is the view from the Harris Hill Overlook. From an elevation of 1,642 feet, the view of Elmira and Big Flats, New York in Chemung County is normally picturesque. This photo today may look like a car show, but on June 23, 1972, the only show was of extensive flooding from one end of the valley to the other. Now let's turn our attention to Steuben County. Al Hall's Diner was located on Hamilton Street in Painted Post, Steuben County. This picture shows the shocking height of the floodwater. This photo was taken under the New York 15, now I-86, overpass looking west down High Street into Painted Post. As the ripples show, this water was flowing rapidly, and the rain was still hammering down. Tillman's Pharmacy in Painted Post, New York, Steuben County, was a local landmark. Here it is, under several feet of water. After the flood, the entire square block behind it was replaced with a new shopping area. This photo is of the Penn Central Railroad Bridge over the Chemung River in Corning, New York. This photo was taken June 22nd, the night before the worst flooding. If you look closely, you can see 15 fully loaded coal cars had been driven onto the bridge, with the hopes of adding weight and stability. That plan failed. The bridge collapsed, along with the coal cars, and was swept downriver. When the water rose above the height of the bridge, the coal cars actually served as a dam and significantly increased the water pressure against the bridge itself. The bridge and the coal cars were dragged down, adding to the wreckage in the river. The bridge was not rebuilt after the flood. West Pulteney Street in Corning, New York, Steuben County under floodwater. This picture is taken looking down Pulteney Street to the east. Notice the McDonald's sign in the upper left corner of the screen and the height of the fast-moving floodwaters on the house in the upper right side. That McDonald's on West Pulteney Street in Corning, unsurprisingly, was destroyed, the entire front roof segment having fallen off the building onto the ground in front of it. That McDonald's was less than 1 year old when it was washed away by Agnes. The Corning Museum of Glass contains artifacts from 3,500 years of glassmaking and is the largest museum of its kind in the world, bringing thousands of tourists to Corning for this cultural landmark. On June 23, 1972, floodwater rose to 5 feet 4 inches on the main floor, completely flooding the rare and special collections in the museum's library, damaging over 500 glass items and covering the entire museum and the 13,000 items in its collection in mud. Thomas S. Buckner, the former director of the museum, called it, quote, "the greatest single catastrophe borne by an American museum," end quote. While the unprecedented damage to the exhibits and the library took years to fully recover from, the Glass Museum audaciously pledged to reopen just 6 weeks after the flooding, and the museum did open its doors 39 days later, on August 1, 1972. What you're looking at here is a portion of the special edition emergency paper printed by the Corning Leader and the Elmira Star-Gazette from June 24, 1972 in Steuben County, the day after the worst flooding. All over the affected region, electrical power was down and newspaper offices were flooded, causing serious problems with the relay of information. The day after the flood, 2 newspapers, the Corning Leader and the Elmira Star-Gazette, combined their resources for an emergency edition printed on hand-cranked mimeograph machines. By June 28th, the papers were back in operation and could report the grim news. Of the 24 deaths that happened in New York, 17 of them occurred in the town of Corning. This clipping from the Star-Gazette, Elmira, New York, June 28, 1972, reports that one of the tragic deaths caused by the floods was a firefighter named Hobart Abbey, who was swept away by the water on June 23rd while responding to the emergency. Mr. Abbey left behind a wife and daughter. So, with more than 50 years of perspective, what can we learn from Hurricane Agnes, and how can we apply those lessons to emergency management today? Lesson number 1, maintain situational awareness. This wasn't supposed to happen. As I described, this was a very unusual weather situation, and the forecast did not call for things to get as bad as they did. Remember, the DEC had determined the swelling Chemung River would crest below flood stage, and the day before the flooding, Corning Mayor Joseph Nasser said river levels were receding. As we know, the next several hours would reveal a disastrously different reality. Weather forecasts have improved significantly since 1972, but no forecast is perfect, and sometimes even hours before a storm arrives, the complete picture is still unclear. Even today, it's common for the quantity of precipitation, intensity, timing, location, and impact to be off, any one of which can create major disruptions. This will likely remain a challenge for many years into the future, if not forever. But for those tasked with managing emergencies, there are things we can do to improve our situational awareness and increase the likelihood that we understand the potential magnitude of an event before it occurs. First, staying on top of the latest forecast is important. Sometimes things can change dramatically in just a few hours. With smartphones and apps, this is easier to do than ever before, but it is also important to stay up to date on nights and weekends when our guard may be down. Maintaining situational awareness isn't just about the forecast. Knowing what flood control structures, such as dams and levees, are in place, what communities could be affected by their failure, and what plans are in place to evacuate are time-consuming activities, but they are information that could save lives when the floodwaters come. Quote, "This wasn't supposed to happen," end quote, is a commonly used phrase, but it does nothing to help those affected by a disaster. Being as situationally aware as possible before and during a disaster is necessary. Number 2, communication and public warning is key. In 1972, many people relied on radio for emergency updates. Paul Orlowski, a newscaster for WENY Radio, was called into the studio in downtown Elmira for an extra shift on the 22nd of June. He was broadcasting emergency evacuation alerts on June 23rd when the power went out at the station, cutting off communications and ending his ability to broadcast. He and a few other employees were trapped in the building for several days, living off snacks from the vending machine. When the 1972 flood struck the Corning Painted Post area, many people at best got a few minutes of warning. Today, technology has provided solutions and a myriad of ways to reach the public in disaster situations. With smartphones, you can utilize reverse 911 or wireless emergency alerts. You can receive weather alerts, access warnings via websites, connect and share information on social media, and contact loved ones via phone, text, or email. But that can also lead to an over-dependence by some on those technologies, and can also lead to the dangerous spreading of misinformation. And while numerous communication solutions exist, it is important to train on various methods and perform exercises to test your capabilities to utilize different technologies before you are in an emergency situation. Lesson number 3, floodwaters don't sleep. Thursday night into the early morning hours of Friday, June 23rd, floodwaters rose quickly, in some locations at more than a foot per hour. Betty Cocho remembers the uncertainty she felt and the fear. Gathered with several neighbors on the front porch of their home on Maple Street in Corning the night of June 22nd, Cocho and her husband Frank watched the water rise at an alarming rate. Each grabbing one of the family dogs, and with their daughter on Frank's back, they ventured out into the road, now a river, heading for Hazel Street where they'd heard the National Guard was stationed. Water came rushing through a nearby alley, knee-deep by the time they crossed the street and over their heads just as they climbed over a fence a block away. They made it to another home on Sly Avenue, where Cocho remembers the floodwaters lapping at the second-story windows by the time a boat rescued the group, narrowly escaping death. The lesson here is that while most flash floods happen during the day, the more deadly flash floods happen at night. Floods such as this prove to be much more dangerous for both citizens trying to escape the floodwaters and for first responders attempting to rescue them. When possible, the public and emergency personnel need to be prepared for a night of flooding before it actually occurs. They need to have escape routes mapped out and have overnight bags packed in case a hasty escape is necessary. Lesson number 4, prevention pays. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or so the saying goes. When appropriately planned for and executed properly, flood protection projects can prevent billions of dollars in property damage and literally save lives. Several of the dams, levees, and dikes that were constructed after the deadly Finger Lakes flood of 1935 proved to be exceptionally good investments. The Mount Morris Dam, completed in 1952, cost $25 million to build, but flood damages prevented by the dam to date are estimated to be about $3 billion. That is a spend-to-save ratio of $1 spent to $120 saved, not to mention an untold number of lives. The Arkport Dam, completed in 1938, cost $1.9 million to construct. Flood damages prevented by the dam are currently estimated at over $50 million, a ratio of $1 spent to $25 saved. And there were numerous other levees, dikes, and smaller flood protection projects that also proved to protect property. The national average for hazard mitigation projects is that for $1 spent, there are $7 saved, but some projects clearly are more valuable than others. Not all of the levees and dikes were successful at holding back the floodwaters. Downstream of Dansville in Livingston County, the flood levees were overtopped. The levees, which were designed to protect agricultural land, wound up doing the opposite. Once breached, the levees held the floodwaters in place, and it took nearly all summer to dry out the fields following the flooding, since the levees prevented the floodwaters from draining. But there is no question that the flooding would have been dramatically worse in 1972 had the existing flood protection projects not been in place. Ideally, this event would present an opportunity to review the projects that worked, rethink the projects that didn't, and enhance the projects that succeeded but came close to failing, like the Arkport Dam, before the next storm like Agnes, and there will be a next, comes to town. But if it ain't maintained, it ain't worth a dollar. Earthen structures are subject to erosion, seepage, animal burrowing, and weakening due to vegetative growth. Concrete structures can crack, weather, and weaken over time. There can be underground piping that leads to foundation instability and failure. Just because a flood control project succeeded in the past does not mean it will work the next time you need it to. Without regular maintenance, you cannot rely on past performance. Most dams in New York are well over 80 years old and were only designed to last 50 years. Many budgets simply don't have the dollars or personnel for proper regular maintenance. It's a serious problem, not only in New York but nationwide. It's easy to kick the can down the road and hope the flood control project holds up next time you need it. But hope is not a viable plan for success. Finally, number 6, facing new challenges. Quote, "I've lived through floods in the past. This'll be no different." End quote. It's a common sentiment, but also famous last words. Much of what we do in emergency management is based on events of the past, this case study being a perfect example. There is much that can be learned by studying past events. But as we learn more about a changing climate and extreme weather events, it is important to be mindful of the fact that just because a flood of a certain magnitude has never happened before in a given location, doesn't mean it can't or won't happen in the future. In fact, it's often just a matter of time. Additionally, while most dams in New York are close to 90 years old, even dams that have been built to modern design standards are built to withstand the floods of the past. Flash floods, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and even earthquakes can impact dams in ways that were previously not well understood, meaning the flood control projects of today often have not been designed to handle the risks of the future. Furthermore, new development downstream of existing dams or levees can increase the consequences of a failure on those that live downstream. Often neither the dam owner nor those that live in harm's way are aware of the risks. Dams are just one example, but because of the consequences when one fails, they are an important consideration. Bottom line, we need to be prepared to face challenges that have not been seen in recorded history, which is not an easy thing to do. Here's a quick look at some of the source material I used in putting together this case study. I appreciate the hard work that went into putting together this material and the photographs that helped tell the story. This case study is for educational purposes only and is not for profit. This ends the case study of deadly Hurricane Agnes, one of the costliest storms in U.S. history and the flood of record for much of central and southern New York. Thank you for taking time to watch this video, and feel free to send any comments or feedback to myself, Nicholas Johnston. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.